The thunder of hooves against the dusty path came to an abrupt halt as Beatrice Morgan's scream pierced the afternoon air. The wagon had lurched violently to one side, throwing her from her perch and into the path of the collapsing vehicle. One moment she'd been scanning the horizon for signs of Willow Creek, her new home. The next, she was trapped beneath the weight of her own belongings, the heavy wooden frame pressing against her chest, making each breath a laborious task. "Help!" Beatrice cried out, her voice thin with panic. "Please, someone help me." The vast Montana landscape of 1878 seemed to swallow her pleas. Miles of golden prairie stretched in every direction, the distant mountains a hazy blue smudge against the sky. She had been a fool to travel alone, but after her father's death, what choice did she have? The teaching position in Willow Creek promised a fresh start, away from Boston's painful memories and suffocating propriety. Now, as dust filled her lungs and the weight of the wagon pressed harder with each desperate movement, Beatrice wondered if she would die here, alone in this beautiful, terrible wilderness. Just as spots began to dance at the edges of her vision, the sound of approaching hoofbeats penetrated her fading consciousness. A shadow fell across her face, blocking the harsh sunlight. "Don't move, madam," a deep voice commanded. "I'm going to get you out." Beatrice caught a glimpse of broad shoulders and a determined face before the man positioned himself at the edge of the overturned wagon. She watched in disbelief as he braced his legs, gripped the wooden frame, and with a guttural groan began to lift. The pressure on her chest eased slightly. "Crawl," he instructed through gritted teeth, muscles straining visibly beneath his worn cotton shirt. "Crawl now while I can hold it." Summoning her remaining strength, Beatrice pulled herself forward inch by agonizing inch, her fingers clawing at the dirt, her skirts catching on the jagged edges of the broken wagon. Just as she dragged herself clear, she heard a thunderous crash and turned to see the man stumbling backward. The wagon collapsed once more. He stood breathing heavily, dust coating his tanned face and dark hair. A cowboy, from his worn leather boots to his sweat-stained hat, now lying in the dirt beside them. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered, unable to manage more as she fought to catch her breath. The man knelt beside her, concern etched in his features. "Are you hurt, madam?" "I don't think so," she replied, though every part of her body screamed in protest as she attempted to sit up. "Just bruised, perhaps." "Name's Preston Wells," he said, helping her to a seated position with gentle hands. "Most folks call me Prees." "Beatrice Morgan," she replied, finally getting a proper look at her rescuer. He couldn't have been more than 30, with eyes the color of the sky after a storm and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. Despite the trail dust covering him, there was something immediately trustworthy in his steady gaze. "Where were you headed, Miss Morgan?" Preston asked, surveying the wreckage of her wagon. One wheel had completely separated from the axle, and her belongings lay scattered across the dirt path. "Willow Creek," she answered, despair washing over her as she followed his gaze. "I'm to be the new school teacher." A flash of recognition crossed his face. "That's a piece of luck, then. I'm headed back that way myself. Ranch is about 5 miles east of town." "The Wells Ranch?" Beatrice asked, remembering the name from correspondence with the town council. Preston nodded, a ghost of a smile appearing beneath his mustache. "My father's place. I work it with my brothers now." He glanced at the sun, already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "We need to collect what we can and get moving. Night comes quick out here, and we're still a good day's ride from town." The reality of her situation struck Beatrice anew. "But my wagon, beyond repair out here," Preston said, not unkindly. "We'll salvage what we can carry on my horse. I can send some of the ranch hands back for the rest once you're safely in town." Beatrice felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She hadn't cried when they'd buried her father 3 months ago. She wouldn't cry over a broken wagon now. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Wells." "Please," he corrected, offering his hand to help her to her feet. Anyone would do the same. But as Beatrice stood, pain shot through her ankle and she stumbled. Preston caught her effortlessly, strong hands steadying her waist. "You are hurt," he observed, his brow furrowing with concern. "It's nothing," Beatrice insisted, though she couldn't bear weight on her right foot without wincing. Preston's expression made it clear he wasn't convinced. Without warning, he swept her into his arms and carried her to a flat rock nearby. "Sit. Let me see." Too surprised to protest, Beatrice found herself perched on the boulder as Preston knelt to examine her ankle. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so weathered by work. "Sprained, not broken," he pronounced after careful assessment. "But you won't be walking far on it." "I can manage," Beatrice began, but Preston was already moving away, returning to the wreckage of her wagon. "First things first," he called over his shoulder. "What can't you leave behind?" For the next hour, they worked together, Preston doing most of the physical labor while Beatrice directed from her perch, identifying essential items. Her books, clothing, and teaching materials were carefully extracted from the wreckage and arranged into bundles that could be secured to Preston's horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that watched the proceedings with what Beatrice fancied was bemused tolerance. As Preston tied the last of the bundles to the saddle, Beatrice hobbled over, using a sturdy branch he'd fashioned into a walking stick. "Where will I sit?" she asked, eyeing the horse dubiously. The animal seemed even larger up close, its withers well above her head. Preston glanced at her, then at the laden horse. "With me," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Before she could formulate a proper objection, he'd lifted her onto the saddle and swung up behind her in one fluid motion. Beatrice felt her breath catch as his arms came around her to take the reins. In Boston, such proximity to a man not related to her would have been scandalous. Here, with the vast emptiness surrounding them and night approaching, it seemed merely practical. Still, she couldn't ignore the solid warmth of him at her back or the way his breath stirred the loose tendrils of hair at her neck. "Comfortable?" Preston asked, his voice closer to her ear than she'd expected. "Yes, thank you," she managed, grateful he couldn't see the flush rising in her cheeks. "There's a place we can make camp about an hour's ride from here," he explained as they set off at an easy pace. "Creek nearby, some shelter from the wind. We'll head for town at first light." The reality that she would be spending the night alone in the wilderness with this stranger suddenly hit Beatrice with full force. As if sensing her tension, Preston added, "Don't worry, Miss Morgan. You're safe with me. I promise you that." Strangely, Beatrice believed him. There was something solid and dependable about Preston Wells. From his easy confidence with the horse to the respectful distance he maintained, despite their close quarters on the saddle. As they rode, Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the territory. He'd been born in these parts, he told her, the middle of 5 brothers. His father had claimed land after the war, building the ranch from nothing into one of the largest spreads in the territory. "And your mother?" Beatrice asked, relaxing incrementally as the steady gait of the horse lulled her. A brief silence. "Passed when I was 14. Fever took her and my youngest brother both." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly. "I lost my mother young as well, and my father just this past winter." Preston's arms tightened momentarily around her in what felt like an instinctive gesture of comfort. "That's a heavy burden to bear alone." "Hence my journey west," Beatrice admitted. "Boston held too many ghosts." They lapsed into companionable silence as the sun dipped lower, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Despite her throbbing ankle and the uncertainty that lay ahead, Beatrice found herself strangely at peace. Perhaps it was the vastness of the sky overhead or the gentle rhythm of the horse beneath them, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt like she could breathe. When they reached the campsite Preston had mentioned, Beatrice understood why he'd chosen it. A small creek bubbled over smooth stones, and a cluster of cottonwood trees provided natural shelter. Preston dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his hands spanning her waist easily. "Rest that ankle," he instructed, setting her gently on a fallen log. "I'll get a fire going." Beatrice watched as he efficiently unloaded the horse, arranged their camp, and gathered wood. There was something mesmerizing about his economical movements, the way he seemed perfectly at home in this wild place. Within minutes, a small fire crackled cheerfully. Pushing back the gathering darkness from his saddlebags, Preston produced jerky, dried apples, and a tin of coffee. "Not quite what you're used to in Boston, I expect," he said with a hint of apology as he handed her a share. "Actually, my father and I lived quite modestly," Beatrice admitted, accepting the simple fare gratefully. "He was a professor of literature, not a wealthy man." Preston looked at her with new interest as he settled across the fire from her. "A professor's daughter. That explains the books you were so determined to save." Beatrice smiled, thinking of the precious volumes carefully wrapped in her shawl. They were his. Dickens, Austen, Shakespeare. "He read to me every night as a child." "My education was somewhat less formal," Preston said, but there was no defensiveness in his tone. "My father taught us what he knew, and we learned the rest from the land." "Different kinds of knowledge, but both valuable," Beatrice observed. She hesitated, then added, "Perhaps. Perhaps you might borrow some of the books sometime, if you'd like." In the firelight, she saw something warm flicker in his eyes. "I'd like that, Miss Morgan." "Beatrice," she corrected him softly. "If I'm to call you Pries, you should call me Beatrice." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Beatrice, then." They talked well into the evening, the fire casting dancing shadows as Beatrice shared stories of her life in Boston and Preston, described the changing seasons on the ranch. She learned that he loved horses above all other animals, that he could predict weather changes by watching the behavior of birds, and that despite his rugged exterior, he had a thoughtful, philosophical streak that reminded her of her father. When Beatrice finally yawned, unable to hide her exhaustion any longer, Preston immediately stood and arranged her bedroll near the fire. He'd insisted she take his blanket as well, despite her protests. "I've slept under the stars with less many a night," he assured her, moving to the opposite side of the fire. "Rest easy, Beatrice. We've got a full day's ride tomorrow." As she settled into the makeshift bed, Beatrice found herself studying his profile in the flickering light. Preston Wells was unlike any man she'd met in Boston, straightforward, capable without pretense. A man shaped by this wild, beautiful land. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the rescue, but for everything." Preston looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." And somehow, despite the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness around them and the ache in her ankle, Beatrice slept more soundly than she had in months, knowing Preston Wells was keeping her safe. Morning arrived with the cheerful chorus of meadowlarks and the soft rustling of Preston already moving about the camp. Beatrice opened her eyes to find coffee brewing over a freshly built fire and Preston returning from the creek, his hair damp and face freshly washed. "Morning," he greeted her, pouring steaming coffee into a tin cup. "How's the ankle?" Beatrice experimentally rotated her foot, wincing slightly. "Better, I think, though still tender." "We'll wrap it before we set out," Preston said, handing her the coffee. "Drink this." "Nothing fancy, but it'll wake you up." The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the carefully prepared brew her housekeeper had made in Boston, but Beatrice found she didn't mind. There was something invigorating about its rawness, much like the landscape around them. While Beatrice sipped her coffee, Preston efficiently broke down their camp. She attempted to help, but he waved her back to her seat. "Rest that ankle. Plenty of time for you to pull your weight once we reach town." The casual remark, implying a future beyond today, gave Beatrice an unexpected flutter of pleasure. She watched as Preston saddled his horse with practiced ease, his movements economical and assured. "What made you decide to become a teacher?" he asked as he worked, glancing at her over the horse's back. "I've always loved learning," Beatrice replied, surprised by his interest. "And after my mother died, I helped my father with his students. It seemed natural to follow that path." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "We need good teachers out here. Too many children growing up without proper schooling." He secured the last of their belongings to the saddle. "My youngest brother, Jack, he's smart, reads everything he can get his hands on. Would have made a fine doctor or lawyer if he'd had the chance." "Perhaps it's not too late," Beatrice suggested. "How old is he?" 17, Preston replied with a small smile. "But try telling him there's more to life than horses and cattle." Before Beatrice could respond, Preston approached with strips of cloth torn from one of his spare shirts. "Let me wrap that ankle before we go." He knelt before her, and Beatrice felt an unexpected intimacy in the gesture as he carefully lifted her injured foot. His hands were gentle but confident as he wrapped the makeshift bandage, securing it firmly but not too tight. "Thank you," she murmured, oddly breathless as he finished, and their eyes met. For a moment neither moved. Then Preston cleared his throat and stood, offering his hand. "Ready to ride." The journey to Willow Creek resumed much as it had the previous day, with Beatrice seated before Preston on his horse. But something subtle had shifted between them. Their conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that felt natural rather than awkward. Preston told her more about the territory, pointing out distant landmarks and sharing the history of the land. Beatrice found herself captivated not just by the stories, but by the evident love in his voice when he spoke of his home. "There's nothing like Montana," he said as they crested a rise that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. "I've been to Denver, even Chicago once, but nothing compares to this." Beatrice had to agree. The vastness of the landscape, the way the land rolled endlessly toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky, it was unlike anything she'd seen in the East. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "Almost overwhelming." "It can be," Preston acknowledged. "Some folks can't handle the openness. Makes them feel too small, too insignificant." He adjusted the reins, his arm brushing against hers. "But others find freedom in it. And you?" Beatrice asked, turning slightly to see his face. His eyes met hers, startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin. "I can't imagine being anywhere else." By mid-afternoon, they began to see signs of civilization: fenced pastures, distant cattle, and eventually the scattered buildings of Willow Creek coming into view. Beatrice felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. Soon she would begin her new life, but it would also mean parting ways with the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. "The school is just at the edge of town," Preston informed her as they approached. "Simple building, but solid. Teachers' quarters are attached at the back." "You seem to know it well," Beatrice observed. Preston chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "Spent enough hours there as a boy, though not always willingly. Old Mrs. Harrington ran the place with an iron fist and a ruler to match." The image of a young, rebellious Preston facing down a stern schoolmistress made Beatrice smile. "Were you a troublemaker, Mr. Wells?" "Let's just say I preferred the outdoors to arithmetic," he replied, and she could hear the grin in his voice. As they rode into town, Beatrice became acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Willow Creek was small enough that a stranger would be noticed, particularly one arriving on the same horse as Preston Wells. "Don't mind them," Preston murmured close to her ear. "News is a precious commodity out here." They stopped first at the general store, where Preston helped her down from the horse with careful hands. The proprietor, a round man with friendly eyes, rushed forward as soon as they entered. "Please." "We weren't expecting you in town," till he stopped short, noticing Beatrice. "Well now, who might this be?" "Harvey, meet Miss Beatrice Morgan, our new schoolteacher," Preston introduced her. "Miss Morgan, Harvey Tompkins runs this establishment and knows everyone's business." "A pleasure, Mr. Tompkins," Beatrice said, extending her hand. "Likewise, madam," Harvey replied, shaking it enthusiastically. "We've been looking forward to your arrival. The children have been running wild without proper schooling these past months." "Miss Morgan had some trouble on the trail," Preston explained. "Wagon overturned about a day's ride east. I found her trapped beneath it." Harvey's eyes widened. "Good Lord! Are you hurt, Miss Morgan?" "Just a sprained ankle, thanks to Mr. Wells's timely assistance," Beatrice assured him. "However, most of my belongings are still with the wagon. I'll send some of the ranch hands to retrieve what they can tomorrow," Preston added. "In the meantime, Miss Morgan will need some supplies to get settled." While Harvey bustled about gathering essentials, bedding, lamps, cookware, and foodstuffs, Beatrice became aware of more townspeople entering the store, each with transparent excuses for sudden shopping needs. Preston seemed amused by the parade of curious locals, making introductions with easy grace. Within an hour, Beatrice had met the mayor, the blacksmith, the doctor, and at least a dozen other residents, all welcoming her with varying degrees of enthusiasm and curiosity. By the time they finally made their way to the schoolhouse, the sun was beginning to set. The building was much as Preston had described, simple but sturdy, with large windows to let in light. The attached living quarters were basic, one main room serving as both kitchen and sitting area, with a small bedroom beyond. It was plain but clean, with a pot-bellied stove for heating and cooking. "It's perfect," Beatrice said, meaning it despite the building's obvious simplicity. After the uncertainty of the past 2 days, the prospect of a place of her own filled her with relief. Preston began bringing in the supplies Harvey had sent over, setting them carefully on the small table. Beatrice watched him move about the space, struck by how his tall frame seemed to fill the small rooms. When the last bundle had been brought in, he stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hands. "I should get going," he said. "It's a couple hours' ride back to the ranch, and my father will be wondering what delayed me." Beatrice felt a pang at his words. "Of course, I've kept you from your responsibilities long enough." "No," Preston said quickly. "That is, it was no trouble. I'm glad I was there when you needed help." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy conversation they'd shared on the trail. "Will you?" Beatrice began, just as Preston said. "I could." They both stopped, then laughed, the tension breaking. "Ladies first," Preston said with a smile. "I was just going to ask if you might visit again," Beatrice said, summoning her courage. "To borrow a book, perhaps, as we discussed." Something warmed in Preston's eyes. "I'd like that. And I was going to offer to check on you in a few days, make sure you're settling in all right." "I'd appreciate that," Beatrice said softly. Preston nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Well then, Miss Morgan, Beatrice, I'll bid you good night." "Good night, please," she replied. "And thank you for everything." He tipped his hat, gave her one last smile, and was gone, leaving Beatrice alone in her new home with the lingering sensation of his presence, and the curious feeling that her life had irrevocably changed in ways that had nothing to do with her new position or location. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity, as Beatrice prepared for the start of classes. The townspeople proved remarkably welcoming, stopping by with small gifts, jars of preserves, fresh bread, a handmade quilt, and staying to chat. Their curiosity about the new teacher thinly veiled beneath their hospitality. From these conversations, Beatrice gleaned more information about Preston Wells and his family. The Wells Ranch was indeed one of the largest in the territory, respected for fair dealings and quality stock. Preston's father, Joseph, was described as a stern but fair man who had helped establish many of the town's institutions. The five Wells brothers were spoken of with a mixture of admiration and wariness, hardworking men known for their loyalty to family and their unwillingness to back down from a fight. Preston's the level-headed one, Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, confided over tea. Always thinking before acting, unlike that hot-headed older brother of his. That's why Joseph sends him to handle business in town. He seemed very capable, Beatrice commented, trying to sound merely conversational. Mrs. Patterson's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. He's a good man, Preston Wells. Not married, you know, though not for lack of opportunity. Before Beatrice could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal her interest, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find a young ranch hand holding the reins of a wagon laden with her belongings from the accident. "Compliments of Mr. Wells, madam," the young man said, tipping his hat. "He sent us out at first light to salvage what we could." Beatrice was touched by the thoughtfulness. "Please thank him for me," she said, helping direct where to place the trunks and boxes. When the ranch hands departed, Mrs. Patterson helped Beatrice unpack, clucking sympathetically over damaged items and exclaiming with delight over the books that had survived unscathed. "Such learning," she marveled, running a finger along the spine of a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare. "The children are fortunate to have a teacher of your caliber, Miss Morgan." "I only hope I can live up to expectations," Beatrice replied, carefully arranging her father's books on the small shelf by the stove. She was still organizing her salvaged belongings that evening when another knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Preston standing there, hat in hand, looking somewhat less trail-worn than when they'd parted. "Good evening, Beatrice," he said, his deep voice sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she assured him, stepping back to allow him entry. "I was just putting away the things your men brought this morning. Thank you for sending them." Preston entered, his gaze taking in the transformed living quarters. "You've made it homey already," he observed. "It doesn't take much," Beatrice said, suddenly self-conscious about the modest space. "Would you like some tea? I was just about to make some." While she busied herself with the kettle, Preston moved to the bookshelf, studying the titles with interest. "Quite a collection," he commented. "Your father had varied tastes." "He believed in reading widely," Beatrice replied, setting cups on the small table. "Philosophy, poetry, novels, history," he said, each offered a different window into human experience. Preston selected a volume and turned it carefully in his hands. "I haven't read much Dickens," he admitted. "My education was more practical." "You should start with that one," Beatrice suggested, nodding toward the book he held. "David Copperfield. It's the story of a boy making his way in the world, finding his place. I think you might enjoy it." Their fingers brushed as he accepted the cup of tea she offered, and Beatrice felt a small shock at the contact, brief though it was. "I'd like to borrow it, if I may," Preston said, setting the book aside carefully. "That is, if you're sure you can spare it." "Of course," Beatrice said, perhaps too quickly. "I've read it many times." They settled at the small table, the domesticity of the scene striking Beatrice as both strange and oddly right. This man who had been a stranger days ago now sat in her home, discussing books and sipping tea as if they'd known each other much longer. "How are you finding Willow Creek?" Preston asked. "I imagine you've been thoroughly interrogated by now." Beatrice laughed. Everyone has been very kind if curious. I've learned quite a bit about the town and about you and your family, I might add. A hint of color touched Preston's cheeks. Nothing too damning, I hope. On the contrary, Beatrice assured him, you seem to be held in high regard. Well, don't believe everything you hear, he said with a self-deprecating smile. Folks tend to exaggerate out here, good and bad. They talked easily as they finished their tea, Preston sharing news of the ranch and Beatrice describing her plans for the school. When he finally rose to leave, the evening had grown late, the lamplight casting a warm glow around the small room. I should let you rest, Preston said, collecting his hat and the borrowed book. Classes start soon, don't they? Monday, Beatrice confirmed, walking him to the door. I admit I'm nervous. I've taught before, but never a school of my own with children of all ages. You'll do fine, Preston said with such conviction that Beatrice found herself believing him. These kids need someone who cares, who'll challenge them to think beyond this town. That's you, Beatrice. His faith in her abilities warmed her more than she cared to admit. Thank you, Pries. At the doorway, he paused, seeming to debate something internally. There's a social at the church next Saturday, he said finally. Nothing fancy, just music and dancing, some food. Would you? That is, might I escort you, help introduce you around properly? Beatrice felt her heart quicken at the invitation. I'd like that very much. The smile that spread across Preston's face made her breath catch. Good, he said simply. I'll come by around 6 then. After he'd gone, Beatrice stood in the doorway watching his figure disappear down the darkened street, a curious mixture of anticipation and confusion swirling within her. She had come west for a fresh start, focused entirely on establishing herself as a teacher. Romance had been the furthest thing from her mind. Yet here she was, counting the days until she would see Preston Wells again, analyzing every word and glance they'd shared. It was foolish. Perhaps they'd known each other mere days, and she had a school to establish, a reputation to build. The last thing she needed was to be distracted by a handsome cowboy. No matter how kind or thoughtful he might be, still, as she readied herself for bed that night, Beatrice couldn't help but wonder what might develop between them. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, the future seemed full of possibilities that had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with the man who had lifted a wagon to save her life. Monday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity, the sky an endless blue above Willow Creek. Beatrice stood nervously at the front of the schoolroom, watching as children of varying ages filed in, eyeing her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. By 9 o'clock, 23 students had settled into the rows of desks, farm children mostly, dressed in simple, clean clothing, their faces scrubbed pink for the occasion. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6, the oldest nearly grown at 17 or 18. Good morning, Beatrice began, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm Miss Morgan, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you. A small girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Miss Morgan, is it true a cowboy saved you from being squished flat as a pancake? Suppressed giggles rippled through the room. Beatrice couldn't help but smile at the directness of the question. It's true that Mr. Wells helped me when my wagon overturned, she confirmed, though I wasn't quite as flat as a pancake. My pa says Pries Wells is the strongest man in the county, volunteered a freckled boy of about 10. Says he once wrestled a bull to the ground with his bare hands. That sounds like quite a feat, Beatrice replied diplomatically. Now, perhaps we should. Are you sweet on him? Called another voice from the back, followed by more giggles. Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks but maintained her composure. That's quite enough of that, she said firmly. We're here to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, not to discuss personal matters. Now, I'd like each of you to stand in turn and introduce yourselves, stating your age and one thing you hope to learn this year. The redirection worked, and soon the children were engaged in proper schoolwork, though Beatrice occasionally caught curious glances and whispered conversations. It seemed her arrival with Preston had already become the subject of town gossip, a fact that both embarrassed and secretly pleased her. The week passed in a blur of lessons, planning, and getting to know her students. Beatrice found herself thoroughly enjoying the challenge, despite the wide range of ages and abilities she needed to accommodate. There was something immensely satisfying about watching understanding dawn on a child's face, whether they were mastering basic letters or wrestling with complex mathematics. By Friday afternoon, she felt she'd established a good rapport with most of her students, though a few of the older boys remained standoffish, clearly testing boundaries. As she dismissed the class for the weekend, reminding them of their assigned reading, Beatrice noticed a familiar figure leaning against the fence outside. Preston straightened as she emerged from the schoolhouse, his face breaking into a warm smile that made her heart skip. "Afternoon, Miss Morgan," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Thought I might walk you home if that's agreeable." "Very agreeable," Beatrice replied, unable to suppress her own smile. "Though you should know you're providing fresh fodder for the town gossips." Preston chuckled, offering his arm as they set off toward her quarters. "I reckon they've been talking since I brought you into town. Might as well give them something worth discussing." The casual comment sent a small thrill through Beatrice. "The children have been full of questions about our dramatic meeting," she told him. "Apparently, you're known for wrestling bulls with your bare hands." "Is that so?" Preston laughed. "Stories grow with each telling out here. Next thing you know, I'll have lifted the wagon with one finger while fighting off a pack of wolves." "And how was your week?" Beatrice asked as they walked, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her and the curious glances from townspeople they passed. "Busy," Preston replied. "Preparing for winter, mainly. Gets harsh up here, need to make sure the cattle have shelter, enough feed stored." He glanced down at her, his expression softening. "Found time to start that book, though." "And," Beatrice prompted, genuinely interested in his opinion. "It's not what I expected," Preston admitted. "Thought it might be dry, but it pulls you in. That Micawber fellow reminds me of a man who passed through here last spring full of grand ideas but never a penny to his name." Their conversation continued easily as they reached Beatrice's quarters. At the door, Preston hesitated. "I should get back to the ranch," he said, though he made no move to leave. "Still looking forward to tomorrow evening, very much," Beatrice confirmed, suddenly shy under his steady gaze. "Good," Preston said softly. He seemed about to say something more, then simply smiled, replaced his hat, and with a small bow, departed. Beatrice watched him go, a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness building within her. Tomorrow evening suddenly seemed both too far away and approaching much too quickly. Saturday arrived bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for celebration. Beatrice spent the morning attending to household chores, then devoted extra time to her appearance, selecting her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical knot. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Beatrice had to suppress a small gasp. Preston stood before her, transformed from the trail-worn cowboy she'd first met. He'd exchanged his work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and well-polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved save for his mustache. "Evening, Beatrice," he greeted her, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise in her cheeks. "You clean up rather well yourself." Preston offered his arm with a small smile. "Shall we?" The church was only a short walk away, and already Beatrice could hear music and laughter spilling from its open doors. Inside, the pews had been pushed back against the walls to create an open space for dancing. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a small group of musicians played lively tunes at the front. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation before the volume rose again, now interspersed with curious glances and whispers. Preston seemed untroubled by the attention, guiding Beatrice through the crowd with easy confidence, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met. "Miss Morgan, so glad you could join us," Mayor Thornton boomed, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "I see Wells here is making sure you get properly acquainted with our little community." "It's a pleasure to be here," Beatrice replied sincerely. "Everyone has been most welcoming. And how's school progressing?" the mayor inquired. "My grandson Timothy says you're the strictest teacher he's ever had, which I take as high praise. Mind you." As Beatrice assured the mayor that Timothy was a bright and promising student, she felt Preston's hand come to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive that sent a shiver up her spine. The evening progressed pleasantly, with Beatrice sampling the home-cooked offerings and meeting more townspeople. Preston remained attentively by her side, occasionally supplying background information in quiet asides that helped her navigate the complex web of relationships that made up Willow Creek's social fabric. When the music shifted to a waltz, Preston turned to her with a questioning look. "Would you care to dance, Miss Morgan?" Beatrice hesitated only briefly. Dancing with Preston would certainly confirm the town's speculation about their relationship, whatever that relationship might be. But as she met his hopeful gaze, she found she didn't care. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Wells." Preston led her to the center of the floor, one hand taking hers while the other settled respectfully at her waist. As they began to move with the music, Beatrice was surprised by his grace. "You dance very well," she observed. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Preston replied with a small smile. "Said no child of hers would embarrass himself at social gatherings, ranch hands or not. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Preston agreed, a hint of old sorrow in his voice. Then, changing the subject, "How are you finding teaching here? Different from Boston, I imagine." "Very different," Beatrice acknowledged as he guided her through a turn. "But in good ways, mostly. The children here have a directness that's refreshing. And they're eager to learn, even if some try to hide it." "They're lucky to have you," Preston said, his eyes holding hers. "This town needs someone who sees beyond its boundaries." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you for saying that." They continued to dance, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Beatrice found herself increasingly aware of his physical presence, the slight roughness of his hand against hers, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. When the music finally ended, Preston reluctantly released her, though his hand remained at the small of her back as he guided her toward the refreshment table. "Thirsty?" he asked. Before she could answer, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A tall man with features similar to Preston's but harder, less refined, stood swaying slightly in the doorway. "That's my brother Matthew," Preston murmured, his posture tensing. "And by the look of him, he's had a few too many." The older Wells brother spotted them and made his way across the room, his movement steady enough despite the obvious signs of intoxication. "Well, if it isn't my little brother," he called, louder than necessary. "And this must be the school teacher everyone's talking about." Preston stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Beatrice and his brother. "Matt, didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Bet you didn't," Matthew replied with a crooked smile. "Thought you'd have the pretty new teacher all to yourself, didn't you?" He turned his attention to Beatrice, sweeping an exaggerated bow. "Matthew Wells, madam, the handsome Wells brother. Pleased to meet you," Beatrice replied politely, though she instinctively disliked his manner. Matt, Preston said, his voice low with warning. Why don't we step outside for a moment? Matthew ignored him, his eyes fixed on Beatrice. So you're the one Prees pulled from under a wagon. Mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Been telling the boys he's been mooning around like a lovesick calf ever since. Beatrice felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, aware that nearby conversations had stopped as people strained to listen. That's enough, Preston said firmly, gripping his brother's arm. You're drunk, Matt. Let's get you home. Matthew shook him off. Don't tell me what to do, little brother. Just because Pa thinks you walk on water doesn't mean the rest of us do. The tension between the brothers was palpable, years of resentment evident in Matthew's slurred words and Preston's tight expression. Beatrice stepped forward, touching Preston's arm gently. Perhaps we should all step outside for some fresh air, she suggested calmly. It's become rather warm in here. Preston looked at her gratefully, while Matthew gave a bark of laughter. She's got more sense than you Prees. Fine, let's take this outside. As they moved toward the door, Preston leaned close to Beatrice. I'm sorry about this, he murmured. Matt's not usually so, public with his grievances. It's all right, she assured him, though in truth, she was unsettled by the confrontation. Outside, the cool evening air seemed to have a sobering effect on Matthew. He leaned against the church wall, regarding them with slightly clearer eyes. So, schoolteacher, he said, his tone less aggressive. What do you make of our little town? I find it charming, Beatrice replied honestly. And the people have been most welcoming. I'll bet they have, Matthew snorted. Nothing folks around here love more than fresh gossip, and you two have given them plenty. He straightened, fixing his gaze on Preston. Pa's asking why you've been in town so much lately. Told him you were helping the new teacher get settled, but he's not blind. Preston's jaw tightened. My business in town is my own, Matt. Sure it is, Matthew agreed too easily. Just like it was your own business when you convinced Pa to send me to the north pasture while you got to go to town for supplies. Convenient how that worked out, you finding the pretty teacher all alone on the trail. It wasn't like that, Preston began, but Matthew waved him off. Save it. I didn't come here to fight with you. He pushed off from the wall, steadying himself. Just came to see what all the fuss was about. His gaze shifted to Beatrice, surprisingly clear despite his intoxication. Be careful with my brother, Miss Morgan. He might seem all solid and dependable, but Wells' men have a way of disappointing the women who care about them. Just ask our mother if she were still around to tell tales. With that parting shot, he turned and walked away, his steps growing steadier as he moved. A heavy silence fell between Beatrice and Preston. She could see the hurt and anger warring in his expression, his hands clenched at his sides. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Matt and it's complicated. Families often are, Beatrice said softly, wanting to comfort him but unsure how. Preston ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its neat arrangement. Would you mind if we didn't go back inside? I'm not much in the mood for socializing anymore. Of course, Beatrice agreed readily. We could walk for a while if you'd like. He nodded gratefully, offering his arm once more. They set off down the main street, now quiet in the evening darkness, neither speaking until they'd put some distance between themselves and the church. Matt wasn't always like that, Preston finally said as they reached the edge of town. When we were boys, he was the one I looked up to, brave, strong, always ready for adventure. What changed? Beatrice asked gently. Preston sighed. Many things. The war, for one. Matt enlisted when he was barely 18, came back different. Then our mother died while he was away. He paused, collecting his thoughts. And I suppose I changed too. Grew up, started taking on more responsibility at the ranch. Our father began to rely on me more, especially for business matters. Matt resented that. It sounds difficult for you both, Beatrice observed. Losing your mother so young, then having roles shift within the family. It was, Preston acknowledged. Is still, he glanced at her, his expression softening. I apologize for ruining your evening. You've done nothing of the sort, Beatrice assured him. I'm enjoying our walk. And she was, despite the uncomfortable encounter with Matthew. There was something peaceful about strolling through the quiet town with Preston, the stars brilliant overhead in a way they never were in Boston. They had reached a small bridge spanning the creek that gave the town its name. Preston stopped, leaning against the railing. May I ask you something, Beatrice? Of course, she replied, joining him at the railing. Why did you really come west? Teaching positions must be plentiful in Boston, and the journey is dangerous for a woman alone. Beatrice considered the question, knowing instinctively that he deserved an honest answer. After my father died, there was nothing keeping me there. The house, our belongings most had to be sold to settle his debts. I could have found a position, yes, but everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of what I'd lost. She gazed out at the dark water flowing beneath them. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Montana Territory, it seemed like Providence, a chance to start fresh, somewhere completely different. And has it been what you hoped? Preston asked quietly. Beatrice turned to face him, surprised to find him watching her intently. It's been more than I hoped, she admitted. I never expected to find such kindness here, such connection. The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. Preston reached out slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. I'm glad you came, he said simply. The tenderness of the gesture, the warmth in his voice. Beatrice felt something shift between them, a barrier dissolving. Instinctively, she leaned toward him, drawn by a force as natural and inevitable as gravity. Preston hesitated only briefly before lowering his head to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Beatrice responded, her hands coming to rest against his chest. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just this: the warmth of his embrace, the softness of his lips against hers, the faint sound of the creek flowing beneath them. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. I've been wanting to do that since I found you on the trail, he confessed. Even when I was covered in dust and barely conscious, Beatrice teased, though her heart was racing. Even then, he affirmed with a smile. There was something about you, Beatrice Morgan, something I recognized, though I can't explain it. She understood exactly what he meant. From their first meeting, despite the dramatic circumstances, there had been an ease between them, a sense of recognition that defied rational explanation. What happens now? She asked, practical concerns intruding on the moment. The town already gossips about us. Your brother clearly disapproves. And I have my position to consider. The school board might not look kindly on the teacher becoming involved with a local rancher so quickly. Preston tucked her hand into the crook of his arm as they began walking again, this time back toward her quarters. People will talk regardless of what we do, he said pragmatically. As for Matt, his opinion isn't the one that matters, and the school board would be fools to lose you over something so trivial. You sound very confident, Beatrice observed. About some things, yes, Preston replied, his voice warm with certainty. About us, Beatrice, I am very confident indeed. His assurance both thrilled and frightened her. It seemed impossible that in just over a week, her life had changed so dramatically, not just her location and occupation, but the very foundation of her future. The practical, cautious part of her warned that it was too fast, too intense. Yet her heart recognized the truth in Preston's words, in the way she felt when they were together. When they reached her door, Preston took both her hands in his, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I'd like to court you properly, Beatrice Morgan, with your permission." The formal request, so earnest and old-fashioned, touched her deeply. "I'd like that very much, Preston Wells," she replied softly. He smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "Then I'll call on you tomorrow if that's agreeable. Perhaps we could ride out to the ranch. I'd like you to see it and meet my father." The prospect was daunting, but Beatrice nodded. "I'd like that." With a final, gentle kiss, Preston bid her good night, waiting until she was safely inside before departing. Beatrice leaned against the closed door, her fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the pressure of his. Whatever she had expected when she set out from Boston, it hadn't been this connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. This man who had literally lifted a burden from her and continued to lighten her heart with his presence. For the first time since her father's death, Beatrice felt truly hopeful about the future. True to his word, Preston arrived the following afternoon, driving a smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of grays. "Thought we'd travel in a bit more style today," he explained as he helped Beatrice up to the seat. "The wagon rode smoother than the trail we took before." The day was perfect for an outing, warm enough to be comfortable but with a crisp edge that hinted at the approaching winter. As they drove through the rolling countryside, Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. Beatrice found herself captivated not just by the tales, but by the obvious love he had for this land. "There it is," Preston said finally, gesturing toward the horizon where buildings had come into view. Wells Ranch. Beatrice was impressed by the size and organization of the place as they approached. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Nearby stood a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all well maintained. Several corrals contained horses in various stages of training, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the autumn gold pastures. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said sincerely. "Your father has built something remarkable here." "We all have," Preston replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Each of us has contributed in our way." He guided the buggy to a stop before the main house. "Ready to meet my father?" Despite her nerves, Beatrice nodded. Preston helped her down, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, a gesture of reassurance that she appreciated. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the same striking blue as Preston's. Joseph Wells had the weathered look of a man who'd spent decades working outdoors, but his clothing was neat and his bearing straight despite his obvious age. "So this is the schoolteacher I've been hearing so much about," he said by way of greeting, his voice deep and resonant. "Welcome to Wells Ranch, Miss Morgan." "Thank you for having me, Mr. Wells," Beatrice replied, offering her hand. "Your son has told me much about your family's accomplishments here." Joseph's handshake was firm but not overwhelming. "Has he now?" Surprising, given how little time he spent at the ranch this past week. The words might have been critical, but there was a glint of humor in the older man's eyes as he glanced at his son. "Figured it was time she saw the place," Preston said easily. "Where's everyone else?" "Your brothers are out checking the north herd," Joseph replied. "Matthew mentioned he ran into you at the social last night." Preston's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "He did." Something passed between father and son, an unspoken communication that Beatrice couldn't interpret. Then Joseph turned back to her with a smile that softened his stern features. "Come inside, Miss Morgan. Mrs. Collins has prepared refreshments, and I'm sure you'd like to rest after the drive." The interior of the house was surprisingly refined, with well-crafted furniture and touches that spoke of a woman's influence still present years after Preston's mother had passed. Joseph led them to a comfortable sitting room where a middle-aged woman, presumably Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, had laid out tea and an impressive array of baked goods. Over refreshments, Joseph asked Beatrice about her background, her teaching experience, and her impressions of Willow Creek. His questions were direct but not intrusive, his manner courteous. Beatrice found herself relaxing as the conversation progressed, recognizing in the father the same straightforward integrity she'd come to appreciate in the son. "Preston tells me you're quite the scholar," Joseph remarked, accepting another cup of tea from Mrs. Collins. "Says you've brought a library with you that would put our towns to shame." "Hardly that," Beatrice demurred. "Just some volumes that were special to my father. He believed strongly in the power of literature to expand one's horizons." "A wise man," Joseph nodded approvingly. "Too many folks out here never look beyond their own fences. It's good for the children to have someone pushing them to think bigger." After tea, Preston suggested showing Beatrice around the ranch. As they walked the grounds, he pointed out improvements he'd implemented: the new breeding program for the horses, irrigation systems for the hay fields, a redesigned corral that made breaking the young stock safer and more efficient. "You've put a lot of thought into this place," Beatrice observed as they paused by a paddock where several handsome colts frolicked. "It's more than just land and livestock to me," Preston admitted, leaning against the fence rail. "It's a legacy, something worth building and preserving." He glanced at her. "Does that sound foolish?" "Not at all," Beatrice assured him. "It's admirable to care so deeply about something, to work toward its future." Preston reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "My father likes you," he said, changing the subject. "He doesn't show it much, but I can tell." "I like him too," Beatrice replied honestly. "I can see where you get your sense of purpose." They continued their tour, eventually making their way to a hilltop that offered a panoramic view of the ranch and surrounding countryside. In the late afternoon light, the landscape was painted in shades of gold and amber, stretching endlessly toward the distant mountains. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Preston confessed, helping Beatrice to a seat on a fallen log. "I come here to think, to remind myself of what matters." "I can see why," Beatrice said, taking in the breathtaking vista. "It puts things in perspective." Preston sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Beatrice," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I know we haven't known each other long. By any reasonable standard, it's far too soon for what I'm feeling." Beatrice's heart quickened at his words. "And what are you feeling, Preston?" He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "That I've found someone I wasn't even looking for. That somehow, in the middle of nowhere, I found exactly where I'm supposed to be." He took her hands in his. "I know it seems fast, maybe even foolish, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The intensity in his eyes, the earnestness of his words, Beatrice felt overwhelmed by the depth of emotion between them. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. "It defies logic, but logic be damned," Preston interrupted gently. "Some things can't be measured or explained, they just are." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch below, Preston drew Beatrice into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, filled with promise and possibility. When they finally parted, Beatrice knew with absolute clarity that her future was irrevocably entwined with this man and this place. The weeks that followed took on a pattern that soon felt wonderfully familiar. Beatrice taught during the week, gradually winning over even the most reluctant students with her combination of high expectations and genuine interest in their progress. Preston rode into town whenever ranch work permitted, sometimes just for an evening meal and conversation, other times to escort her on outings to nearby beauty spots or social events. Their courtship became the subject of good-natured teasing among the townspeople, but the initial gossip soon gave way to acceptance. Beatrice found herself welcomed into the community not just as the schoolteacher, but as Preston Wells's chosen companion, a distinction that opened doors and created connections she might otherwise have missed. October gave way to November, bringing the first snowfall and preparations for the harsh Montana winter. Preston visited less frequently as the demands of the ranch increased, but each reunion was all the sweeter for the separation. Beatrice threw herself into planning the school's Christmas pageant, determined to give her students an experience they would remember. It was during the final rehearsal, just days before the performance, that disaster struck. Beatrice had stayed late at the schoolhouse, making last-minute adjustments to costumes and scenery. The temperature had dropped precipitously during the afternoon, and by the time she prepared to leave, a full blizzard was raging outside. Knowing it would be foolish to attempt the short walk to her quarters in such conditions, Beatrice resolved to spend the night at the school. She built up the fire in the stove, arranged a makeshift bed from spare blankets kept for emergency, and settled in to wait out the storm. She must have dozed off, for the next thing she knew, she was awakened by a crash and the alarming sight of flames licking up the wall near the stove. In her exhaustion, she had stoked the fire too high, and a spark had apparently escaped to ignite the dry wooden wall. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, grabbing the bucket of water she kept near the stove and throwing it on the flames. The fire hissed, but continued to spread, feeding on the aged timber of the schoolhouse walls. Smoke began to fill the room, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. Realizing the fire was beyond her ability to control, Beatrice tried to reach the door, but found the path blocked by rapidly spreading flames. Coughing violently, she retreated to the far corner of the room, frantically searching for another exit. The windows were an option, but the storm outside raged with killing intensity. If she escaped the fire, the blizzard might claim her instead. Just as despair began to overtake her, Beatrice heard a sound above the roar of the flames and howl of the wind, the pounding of fists against the schoolhouse door, followed by a voice she recognized even through the crackling fire. "Beatrice, can you hear me? Beatrice, Preston." She cried, her voice raw from smoke. "I'm here, the fire it's spreading too fast." The door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and a figure wrapped against the storm. Preston took in the situation at a glance, his eyes finding Beatrice through the thickening smoke. "Stay low," he shouted, dropping to a crouch himself as he made his way toward her, a wet blanket held before him as shield against the flames. When he reached her, Preston wrapped the damp blanket around her securely. "Keep your face covered," he instructed, lifting her into his arms, "and hold on to me." Beatrice buried her face against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart as he navigated back through the burning schoolhouse. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but Preston moved with determination, shielding her with his body as burning debris fell around them. They burst into the icy night, the contrast between fiery heat and winter cold shocking Beatrice's system. Through the blanket, she could see the schoolhouse now fully engulfed, flames shooting skyward despite the driving snow. "My horse is tethered nearby," Preston said, his voice strained from smoke and exertion. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Beatrice managed, though in truth she wasn't certain she could stay upright. Preston set her gently on her feet, keeping one arm around her as he led her to where his horse waited, nervously shifting in the storm. With efficiency born of practice, he lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, securing her against his chest with one strong arm while taking the reins with the other. "My quarters are closest," Beatrice said, realizing belatedly that they needed shelter immediately. Preston shook his head. Too dangerous. The fire could spread in this wind. We need to get to safety. They set off into the blizzard, the burning schoolhouse receding behind them. Beatrice lost all sense of direction as Preston guided the horse through the blinding snow, relying on instinct and experience where visibility failed. She focused on staying conscious, fighting the combination of smoke inhalation and bitter cold that threatened to overwhelm her. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, they reached a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Preston dismounted quickly, lifting Beatrice down and carrying her to the door. "Lineman's cabin," he explained briefly as he kicked the door open. "Used by the telegraph company when they're working on the lines. Empty now." The interior was basic, but found a single room with a small stove, rough-hewn table and chairs, and a narrow bed. Preston set Beatrice down carefully on the edge of the bed, then immediately set about lighting the stove with supplies stored nearby. "Are you hurt?" he asked as flames caught in the stove, casting flickering light around the cabin. "No," Beatrice assured him, though her throat burned and her lungs ached with each breath. "Just smoke. You came just in time." Preston knelt before her, his face grave as he took her soot-stained hands in his. "When I saw the fire from the ridge," he broke off, emotion overwhelming him. "I thought I might lose you." "How did you know I was there?" Beatrice asked, trying to make sense of his timely arrival. "I was on my way to town to check on you before the storm worsened," Preston explained. "Got caught in the blizzard, almost turned back. Thank God I didn't." As warmth slowly filled the cabin, Preston helped Beatrice remove her outer layers, now damp with melted snow and smelling of smoke. He found a spare blanket in a trunk, wrapping it around her shoulders before turning his attention to melting snow for water. "The schoolhouse," Beatrice said suddenly, the full impact of what had happened hitting her. "All those books, the children's work, the pageant costumes, don't think about that now," Preston soothed, bringing her a cup of water. "What matters is that you're safe." But Beatrice couldn't stop the tears that began to flow. "I failed them," she whispered. "The children were so looking forward to the pageant, and the town trusted me with their school." Preston sat beside her, drawing her into his arms. "Listen to me, Beatrice Morgan. You haven't failed anyone. Buildings can be rebuilt, books replaced. What can't be replaced is you." She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, struck by the intensity of emotion in his face. "Preston, I love you," he said simply, the words falling between them like a physical presence. "I think I've loved you since I found you trapped beneath that wagon. Maybe even before, if such things are possible." Despite everything, the fire, the narrow escape, the loss of the schoolhouse, Beatrice felt a surge of joy at his declaration. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. Preston's kiss was tender, reaffirming life and possibility in the face of what they'd just survived. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Marry me," he said softly. "Not someday, not eventually, soon. I don't want to waste another day without you as my wife." The suddenness of the proposal might have given Beatrice pause under different circumstances. But the night's events had stripped away pretense and caution, leaving only what truly mattered. And what mattered, she knew with absolute certainty, was Preston Wells. "Yes," she answered, her heart full. "Yes, I'll marry you." They spent the night in the lineman's cabin, the blizzard raging outside while they talked of the future, making plans and sharing dreams. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white. They rode back to town to find the schoolhouse a charred ruin, but the rest of the buildings untouched thanks to the heavy snow that had contained the flames. The news of Beatrice's close call and Preston's rescue spread quickly through town, as did their engagement. Mayor Thornton immediately called a town meeting to address the loss of the schoolhouse. "We'll rebuild, of course," he announced to the assembled townspeople. "Bigger and better than before, but it will take time. In the meantime, we need a place for classes to continue." "The children can use the meeting room at the ranch house," Preston offered, standing with his arm protectively around Beatrice. "It's spacious, warm, and we can arrange transportation for the students." The proposal was met with approval, and within days, Beatrice had established a temporary classroom at Wells Ranch. The new arrangement had unexpected benefits. The children were fascinated by the working ranch, and Preston incorporated practical lessons in agriculture, animal husbandry, and land management that complemented Beatrice's more traditional curriculum. Joseph Wells, initially reserved about the influx of young people into his home, soon became an enthusiastic participant, sharing stories of the early days of settlement that brought history to life for the students. Even Matthew, after an initial period of sullen resistance, began to show interest in the educational activities, eventually offering to teach the older boys about horse training. Christmas came and went, the planned pageant replaced by a simpler but no less meaningful celebration at the ranch. January brought record cold but steady progress on the new schoolhouse, with every able-bodied man in the community contributing labor. Through it all, Beatrice and Preston's relationship deepened. They were married on a bright February morning in the newly completed church, with the entire town in attendance. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory silk that Preston had arranged to be sent from Denver, and carried a bouquet of hothouse flowers that must have cost a small fortune to obtain in the depths of a Montana winter. "Worth every penny," Preston whispered when she marveled at the extravagance. "You deserve beautiful things, Beatrice Wells." The name, so new and yet so right, brought tears to her eyes. "I have everything beautiful I could want," she assured him, looking around at the community that had become her own, the family she had joined, and the man who had lifted far more than a wagon from her shoulders. As spring arrived, bringing new life to the ranch and the completion of the schoolhouse in town, Beatrice found herself facing a different sort of new beginning. The morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks was confirmed by the town doctor as the first sign of impending motherhood. "A baby," Preston breathed when she told him the news, his face transformed with wonder. "Our child." He lifted her in a gentle embrace, mindful of her condition even in his excitement. "Are you happy?" he asked, studying her face. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Beatrice assured him, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "When I came west, I was seeking a new beginning, a place to heal from loss. I never expected to find a home, a family, a love like this." Preston's smile was tender as he placed his hand over hers. "And all because a wagon overturned on a dusty trail." "No," Beatrice corrected him softly. "All because you were strong enough to lift it." 5 years later, Beatrice stood on the porch of their home, watching as Preston taught their son to ride his first pony. The boy, named Joseph after his grandfather, had inherited his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind. At 4, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, thoughtful like Preston, curious like Beatrice, and with a deep love for the land that surrounded him. Beside Beatrice, 2-year-old Margaret toddled on sturdy legs, clutching her mother's skirts as she watched her brother and father with wide, wondering eyes. Soon she too would be on horseback, learning the ways of the ranch that would be her heritage. The Wells Ranch had prospered under Preston's management following his father's semi-retirement. The original house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and the success of Preston's breeding program had made Wells horses sought after throughout the territory. Beatrice continued to teach at the new schoolhouse in town, dividing her time between education and family. Her students now included children of families who had moved to the area, specifically because of the school's growing reputation for excellence. Matthew had eventually made peace with his brother, finding his own path as a horse trader whose business complemented rather than competed with the ranch. The younger Wells brothers had all married and established their own households nearby, creating an extended family network that provided support and companionship. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Preston returned from the corral, lifting little Margaret into his arms as he joined Beatrice on the porch. "Another successful riding lesson," he reported, his pride in their son evident. "He's a natural, just like his mother." Beatrice laughed at the compliment. "I believe you're thinking of yourself, Mr. Wells. I was terrified of horses when I arrived here. And now—" Preston challenged with a smile, shifting Margaret to his hip so he could slip his free arm around Beatrice's waist. "Now I can't imagine life without them," she admitted. "Or without any of this." Her gesture encompassed the ranch, their children, the life they had built together. Preston's expression softened as he bent to kiss her, a gesture as familiar now as breathing yet still capable of sending a thrill through her. "Neither can I," he murmured. "Best decision I ever made, helping that woman trapped beneath a wagon. Best decision I ever made, allowing a handsome cowboy to rescue me," Beatrice countered with a smile. As they stood together watching the sunset, their children safe in their embrace, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the tragedy of losing her parents to the hope of a new beginning in the West, from the danger of the overturned wagon to the safety of Preston's arms, every step, even the painful ones, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In Preston Wells, she had found not just a husband but a partner, someone who matched her strength with his own, who challenged her to grow even as he supported her dreams. In Willow Creek, she had found not just a job but a purpose, a community that valued her contributions and welcomed her as one of their own. And in the vast, beautiful wilderness of Montana Territory, Beatrice Morgan Wells had found not just a place to live but a home for her heart.